All right, welcome to the 20th workshop in the Return to Freud. This is an ongoing workshop series covering the original Freudian materials, where we try to stay true to the original Freudian texts in interpreting them, but also having an open discourse about the relevance of these texts to contemporary spirituality, philosophy, science, and say psychology. So with that being said, in this workshop, we are going to be covering two papers, one from 1912, one from 1913. The first one is an important note for practicing psychoanalysts, and the second one is an interesting short paper on some of Freud's ideas about what we can say in general about dream images, hopefully stimulating papers for conversation afterwards. So I'll share my screen and we'll get into this. View. All right, so the first paper, Recommendations to Physicians Practicing Psychoanalysis from 1912. Freud here is telling us that he's inventing rules, technical rules for analysts that have been arrived at from his own experience and from many unfortunate results. So I think this is basically introducing a Hegelian principle that knowledge is here won in mistakes, and that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to make big mistakes. And in Freud's case, pioneering a certain clinical practice related to psychological health, I'm sure he made some enormous mistakes with big consequences. But that rules born of these mistakes can have practical application and avoid making the same catastrophic mistake over and over again. So the basic idea he introduces is extremely simple. And it's a rule here which actually requires a lot of consciousness or sort of conscious development on the part of the analyst. He refers to the doctor in many cases, but the rule is basically that the analyst should be practicing with an evenly suspended attention. He makes the distinction of evenly suspended attention over deliberate attention. So he's basically saying that the analyst should try as best as possible to cultivate a type of open awareness, an open-ended awareness, as opposed to a deliberate, concentrated mode of attention. And this practice is twofold. It helps the analyst practically if they're dealing with lots of patients in a single day, because having a deliberate form of attention is extremely energy expensive. But I think the more important point is that it prevents the analyst from projecting expectations on the analyst. And what he's trying to say here is that when we are in this deliberate mode of consciousness, this deliberate intentional mode, we are coming at the world with all of our presuppositions. We are coming at the world with all of our sort of ideological background. And the point here is that a practicing analyst should be kind of like a void point or blank canvas upon which the analyst can just simply freely associate without any ideological judgment or distortion on the part of the analyst. So I think this is a really important point. So he says that evenly suspended attention means that you give equal notice to anything. When you have a deliberate attention and you've got certain ideological presuppositions in your consciousness, that will inherently bias you to a certain point of view, which will pick out certain things as important over other things. So he's saying here to give equal notice to everything. And this is, I think, practiced by Freud really well, because one of the interesting things about Freud's writings is that he pays very close attention to things in everyday life, which most people pay little attention to. So I think that this comes from cultivating an evenly suspended attention, where you can find something profound in something seemingly mundane. like having a shower, going to the toilet, waking up in the morning. If you're paying attention to these things with an evenly expended attention, instead of presupposing that these things have no meaning, that this is an important thing for day-to-day life, I think, as well. So he proposes that this idea is a fundamental counterpart to the rule of psychoanalysis that a patient should communicate everything without criticism and censorship, i.e. free association. So we've covered this principle in previous workshops, so I would recommend going into that if you're new to this idea. But the idea of free association is basically that you're going to try to prevent yourself from rationally censoring yourself or rationally criticizing yourself in regards to the ideas that spontaneously come into your head. What you want to do is basically, in free association, is speak freely everything that comes to mind, even if it's embarrassing, even especially if it's embarrassing, even especially if it's disturbing to your rational day-to-day consciousness. And the point of that is that through the free association, this was Freud's way of accessing the core of the unconscious. So the analyst should, this is a direct quote from the paper, he should simply listen and not bother about whether he is keeping anything in mind. And that's the principle, basically. So then he goes on to make further suggestions. He advises that the analyst should avoid taking notes during a session because it would put you in a deliberate mode of consciousness. Again, if you're writing, you're in a very focused, and you will, because you can't write down everything, you will pick out certain things that you think are of high importance. Again, it would ruin the evenly suspended attention. And I think that this is an interesting point to dwell on, even if it seems insignificant, because when I was even doing image searches for this presentation, it was hard for me to find an image of an analyst. It was hard for me to find an image of an analyst who wasn't taking notes. Every image of an analyst I found, they were taking notes. So it was an interesting point that this sort of seemingly insignificant detail that Freud's saying it has sort of been overlooked. But he suggests to write down afterwards in the evening, after you've had a chance to reflect on the day and the sessions. One of the reasons why he's suggesting this, again, is because he's trying to create the conditions of possibility where the analyst has as open a mind as possible, because he believes that when the analyst has no purpose in mind, when the analyst has no agenda, let's say, that it allows the analyst to be surprised by the anal's end. What he's trying to do here is cultivate this element of surprise, which oftentimes is lost in people of knowledge, where there's kind of like an unconscious presupposition that I know everything already. There's nothing new for me to discover here. Where Freud is saying that with every analyst, with every analsand, with every patient that comes into your office, you could be massively surprised. You could discover something new. And he's trying here to cultivate a awareness of that, and to sort of a method of practice, let's say, that would be conducive to that discovery. So he also introduces a really important motto, and it's a motto that was introduced in the paper in French, but I translated it, or it was also translated in a footnote. But the motto is, I addressed his wounds and God cured him, which I think is a very interesting motto, especially considering that Freud is often known as an atheist, that he would use a motto involving God curing the patient and not the analyst. But what I take this to mean is, and he says this in the context that analysts should operate as surgeons emotionally, meaning that they should be cold. I think this actually came up in a session recently, maybe 2 or 3 sessions ago, where I said that when you're practicing as an analyst, oftentimes you can come across as cold but you want to sort of come across as cold because you are here functioning as this again, with this evenly suspended attention, almost like a empty background for the analsand to free associate. You shouldn't get emotionally wrapped up with these associations. But that the idea here is that people can be cured from within by themselves if they simply have the open space to free associate. There was a point I wanted to make here that I thought was really important in my own reflections when specifically reflecting on this motto of "I addressed his wounds, God cured him," is that Freud was trying to prevent a culture of analysts who were obsessed with healing people. And I see this a lot in the New Age community and New Age spirituality in particular, where people get addicted to healing other people, like that they can be the cause of someone else's healing. And I think Freud was trying to warn against this tendency. He was trying to warn against this idea that actually you aren't healing them, that in some sense the healing is only coming from within that person. So again, we have a summary here that he's basically saying there's two fundamental rules of psychoanalysis. On the side of the analsand, you have free association, and I took some liberties in calling the other one free interpretation, because basically the free interpretation is that you are disconnecting from your own presuppositions and your own body of knowledge, and you're just kind of this open consciousness, this open awareness. So here's the formula, is an analyst must turn his own unconscious like a receptive organ towards the transmitting unconscious of the patient. So that's a really interesting image there that I got in my head. And it's kind of the opposite of the image I'm displaying here on the screen of two books, two people with books as heads. It's kind of the opposite of that, because you're not like, basically as an analyst, you shouldn't just try to be a book, you know, like this is what I learned in X text and you should refer to X text if you'd like to heal yourself. It's more that you are just, again, dropping all of your knowledge in that way, and you're just relying on the knowledge that's already inherent in the unconscious. That's the overall point, I think. So the consequence of this is that, and this is really an important point, I think, for the historicity and the institutionalization of psychoanalysis, is that it actually demands a lot of self-work on the part of the analyst. Namely, he says that the analyst must have undergone, quote unquote, analytic purification, which Freud equates with becoming aware of his or her own complexes, unresolved repressions as blind spots. As we talked about in a previous workshop, Freud attributes to every subject a mother and father complex. So let's say, for argument's sake, that what he's saying here is that analytic purification involves a coming to awareness of one's own mother and father complexes and a kind of transcendence of the Oedipal constellation. But this is extremely difficult to do. And actually, in a conversation I had with someone this past week, I think it's the location of a lot of potential spiritual bypassing, quote unquote, where people pretend to be over their mother and father complexes, but actually haven't yet overcome their father and mother complexes. So analytic purification, he says here, has to involve learning from your own mind and cannot be gained from studying books or lectures. So he makes an interesting point that with increasing self-knowledge, you gain increasing self-control, but that this process never really ends. So that's an interesting point when we think about the institutionalization of the quote unquote end of analysis, because again, according to Freud, it never really ends, that you're always incomplete. And this actually could be linked to something that Lacan notes when he sort of jokingly refers to Socrates, when he says, he sort of makes fun of Socrates' notion, know thyself. Lacan sort of says that you can never really fully know yourself, that it's always incomplete. There's always something new to be learned. However, without self-analysis, the analyst will actually not only not be able to heal others, but will actually be a danger to others, because precisely they will be projecting their own complexes onto the other person. And that's what he refers to as easily falling into the temptation of projection. So what this paper really leads me to is the idea that the institutionalization of psychoanalysis is actually an impossible task in some way, because it demands, again, so much on the part of the analyst to have gone through a deep process, which is probably why there's so much controversy over psychoanalysis as a knowledge discipline, because whenever people criticize psychoanalysis, it's often for the institutionalization and the historical failures of it, as opposed to like someone actually going into the original Freudian text and actually having a knowledge of it. Like, I actually watched a documentary yesterday where there were psychoanalysts working in Freud's name who thought it was a good idea to do twin and triplet studies by separating them at birth and then seeing how different they were 20 years later, which is extraordinarily unethical and never something Freud would do, but certainly something that was done in Freud's name. So it's again, there's this huge problem of the historicity of psychoanalysis, which I think is open to philosophical interpretation here. So he says, doctor should be opaque to his parents like a mirror. And again, many Lacanian models of the mind here revolve around the mirror. And this is here a direct quote by Freud, where he says that the analyst should be like a mirror, quote, showing nothing but what is shown. And that's why the analyst can be perceived as cold, because they are only meant to reflect back what the patient is telling them, not projecting any of their own ideological bias onto them. And then crucial, he says, and this would be a very deep temptation, and I think one that definitely should be avoided, which is that what should the analyst do once the analysand has overcome some of their inner complexes, what brought them to analysis? He suggests that the analyst should not guide their development based on their own desire. Again, the problem here for the institutionalization of psychoanalysis is that you can have analysts that project their own desire onto the patients, which will again muddle them up even more. So he then makes another really interesting point, that not every neurotic or patient has a high capacity for sublimation, and even that sublimation is often the cause of their neurosis. And so, quote unquote, we should tolerate weakness, or here in perhaps Lacanian terms, referring to castration, referring to the feeling of impotence, and that this should be tolerated. But the idea here is that Freud's suggesting that there's differences in capacity for sublimation among human beings, and that some human beings can sublimate without becoming neurotic, and some human beings should stay closer to the ground, the instinctual ground of their being, because leaving that instinctual ground is actually the cause of their neurosis. Now, in my own personal development, I have tried to sublimate, perhaps to an extreme degree, and I would say that part of my sublimation activity is in fact the cause of my neurosis. So I think that is a point, but I don't think that that should in itself deter someone from trying to push their capacities for sublimation. I think people, as long as they're aware of their own, as long as they're aware of the potential pitfalls and problems of sublimation, I think if someone has that desire and has that aim in their own capacity, then they should go for it. Now, he ends, let me just see, I think this is the last, this is the last slide for this paper. So he says that, and this is a crucial one, and one that I think gave me pause self-reflectively, is that overthinking and concentrating, again, this deliberate form of consciousness, cannot solve the riddles of the neurosis. He said, They can only be solved by excluding and suspending criticism. And this is a very important point in regards to our contemporary philosophical and humanities departments, because if you think about the philosophy and humanities departments, they are based on critical theory. In other words, they're critics. And he's saying here that being a critic is actually kind of the whole problem of the neuroses in some sense. That the critical mind is defending itself against its knots, defending itself against its own inner turmoil, as opposed to really understanding it. So suspending this critical faculty as crucial, and to let what wants to come to the surface come to the surface. And to be brave. I think this is an incredible act of bravery. It's an incredible act of courage to let what needs to come to the surface come to the surface. And we need to create the environments where that can happen. I think that's one of the points I take from this paper. So patients who practice the art of intellectual discussion, this is also a self-reflective point I wanted to dwell on a little bit while I was reading, is that patients who practice the art of intellectual discussion during treatment are trying to avoid the overcoming of their neuroses. So I've seen this many times where it's very tempting and very easy to take a certain neurotic problem you have and try to intellectualize it to death. But that is not going to involve the real emotional work that's needed in sort of bringing the core of the neurosis to consciousness. So his main requirement is to learn by experience over analytic writings. This is perhaps one of the reasons why Lacan is criticized so often, because there are many people who follow him who focus on his analytic writings over their own experience. I think that's something that, as sort of many of us have read Lacan, we should be sort of open to discussing. And he makes a very interesting point at the very end of the paper, which is that his biggest problem, personally, Freud saying his biggest problem is dealing with relatives. He said, I'm at an utter loss to know how to deal with relatives of people undergoing analysis. And I think that point in particular is something that leads me to suspect that movements towards group analysis, or movements towards family analysis, or movements towards community analysis is something that needs to be developed more fully and emphasized, because if you're just liberating an individual from their neurotic pattern, the problem is that relatives often would like that individual to remain neurotic, because the order of the social hierarchy depends on the neurosis staying in place. This, of course, probably happens oftentimes with parents and children, but also love partners. So worth reflecting on. So I'll move on quickly to the other paper, observations and examples from analytic practice, where Freud here is giving perhaps an untypical paper for Freud's style. Freud explicitly states that he is interested in idiosyncratic subjective material and very rarely generalizes to what we can say about dreams as a whole. But in this paper, he takes a shot at some general categories that may be of relevance to the structure of a dream. So he starts off by saying, this is a generalized point of view from observations made in analytic practice. And then he goes on to name certain structures that he sees as general. The first is a dream with an unrecognized precipitating cause, often an external noise. In the paper, he gives the example of someone dreaming of, I think, harming a priest or some religious authority, which was caused by a ugly noise from the local church outside. Now, I've had this happen many times in my dreams, where the alarm noise on my clock or the alarm noise on my cell phone will actually not wake me up, but cause a dream image in the dream itself. So it's basically that there's this unrecognized precipitating cause of a dream image. The second point he makes is that the time of day in dreams often stands for the age of the dreamer. That the time of the day has something to do with basically the developmental pattern of the dreamer. Some of these I can just go over quite briefly and shortly, but just get through some of these points. I think some of them are far more interesting than others. The third one is that representation of ages in dreams stand for traumatic events at that age. So basically, if you are represented in the dream, or you see a figure represented in the dream as your 5-year-old self, or you have a representation of a dream of your 15-year-old self, that age stands for a traumatic event that happened at that age. Trying to think about something that I've experienced in that direction. But a lot of the traumatic dreams I've been having lately are related to material from the past year or two. So it's not really relevant to the dreams that I've been having recently. Fourth, the position when waking from a dream. So in other words, and this happens to me every morning or most mornings, where the virtual dream position is the inverse of the actual body position. So the actual position your body's in on the bed, you might have a virtual figure in the dream that's in the inverse position. He gave an example of this in the paper of a bisexual fantasy. And indeed, in my own existence, it could be related to these bisexual fantasies. Now in the paper, the numbers skip for a reason why I'm not quite sure, like it skips from number 4 to number 9. But I don't have an explanation for why it's written that way. Could be a mistake in the paper. But anyway, number 9 is two familiar. Now this is one that recently happened to me. 2 familiar rooms turned into one room, where you'll have a basically a superposition of 2 rooms, which are merged as one room. Usually, again, they're 2 familiar rooms. And this happened to me in a dream recently, where 2 rooms from 2 family homes were sort of superimposed. And that's a process, a condensation process that happens in dreams, which was described in our workshop on dreams. However, he gives a very interesting explanation for why this happens. He links it to the confusion around female genitalia. The inability of the child to make sense of the difference between the female's genital region and the anus. This could be pushed back to the workshop on dreams we had regarding children's theories of sexuality, where Freud was pretty clear that children had a difficult time theorizing the vagina and oftentimes could not think the vagina. Namely hypothesizing that children come out of the anus, for example. 10, the overcoat as a symbol of a man in a woman's dreams. I haven't had that occur in my dreams, but I'm also not a woman, so I'm not sure if any of you have had that experience. Now this 13 was very interesting because it stimulated many discussions between myself and a friend regarding the dream of disgraced feet or shoes. And Freud's explanation for this is penis envy, funny enough. That the disgraced feet or shoes, the dream of not having shoes, or the dream of being barefoot and being made fun of for being barefoot, is basically a substitute image for the earlier feeling of lacking a penis or the misfortune of not having a penis, and that this translates into the difficulty to fail in professional life. That's a really interesting one to discuss, or at least I've had some fun discussing that this week. Number 15 is, and this one might resonate with some of you, it definitely resonates with myself. He says that self-criticism by neurotics, in other words, self-reproaches, are the concealment or boasting in self-criticism. In other words, when the neurotic criticizes himself, or reproaches himself for something, it's a way of concealed boasting. That's very interesting. And this is the last page. I just jammed 4 onto here. Number 19 are considerations of representability, sitting opposite an emperor or equals sitting next to the father. So in other words, if you're representing someone in the dream of a high status as an emperor or a king, this is a representation of the father. Number 20, dreaming about dead people often has a meaning related to your own death and or the repudiation of your own death. That's an interesting dream in the context of Freud and Jung's own falling out from each other, because the falling out between Freud and Jung occurred around a dream of this nature. And Freud's claim was that Jung was dreaming about killing him, whereas Jung was trying to attribute it to some meaning in the collective unconscious. That's perhaps something that we can go into later, or can be found in a previous workshop we did. 21, fragmentary dreams relating to the subject of the dream. Not really sure how to expand on that anymore, but other than that, it could be that the fragmentary nature of the dream is a reference to the subject's own incompletion. And then finally, the last point is that the appearance in the dream of symptoms of illness is related to the continuation of analysis, namely the cause of the subject's own neurosis. So becoming sick in the dream is related to the psychological symptom and the cause of the neurosis. So I will stop sharing, but those were the 2 papers for today. Thank you so much for your attention. And I'll just open it up here. Maybe give some more commentary. But the first paper there, in my view, is a really important technical one, because it really gave me a nice complementary image of what the analyst should be doing in relationship to the analsand, because the principle of free association is such a helpful guide and such a helpful tool to learn about the unconscious. But his recommendations for the analyst there are many points about the behavior of the analyst that I will take with me in my day-to-day life, when I'm discussing personal matters with close people. I felt like it was very, very helpful, very useful.
Do you read me? Am I coming through?
You're coming through.
All right, so thank you for the presentation. There's just so many points to fixate on, which is in a way funny, since that's exactly what Freud is speaking against here, since he's saying that you should not fixate on any points.
At least not in an analytic session.
Yeah, but what is really the center of this, or his arguments, could be the very dialectics of awareness and selection, and the presuppositions that underlie all psychical selection in some way. So he's saying that the proper ideal attitude is an evenly suspended attention to nothing in particular. So it's in a way some kind of like universal attention. What I'm reminded of is J. Krishnamurti's idea of some kind of choiceless awareness, which doesn't take any particular point in consciousness as somehow more valuable than others. So it's a kind of like non-selective awareness, and there is an argument behind it, which is similar, which is that fixing on one point or selecting in your consciousness on some trait, it always involves your own bias, which distorts what is available to consciousness universally. Yeah, but this is really interesting schema that we could speak about more, but what I was thinking about when reading the first paper on recommendations to physicians was, do we maybe have here prospects for Freud's own criticism for what in later period would be called ego-based psychology? I think that this is possible, but I'm interested to hear what you think about that.
If anyone else wants to go, otherwise I can go. I do think that this first paper, and this is why I tried to emphasize this in the presentation, is that I do think this paper offers us many keys and clues to why the institutionalization of psychoanalysis was so difficult and riddled, but with so many problems and so much criticism, is because it's incredibly difficult for a man or woman of professional development to operate in a day-to-day way with sort of an evenly suspended attention and sort of letting go of all of their unconscious or all of their presuppositions of basically all of their knowledge. And the tendency to ideological projection in an analytic session was probably an endemic problem throughout the 20th century. I know in all of the representations of institutional psychoanalysis that I've seen, either in documentaries or movies, are often criticizing the psychoanalyst for projecting onto the patient. Now, what's coming to mind is a movie I watched recently called Harold and Maude, where Harold, a young boy, is exploring death fantasies, and he goes to see a Freudian psychoanalyst, and the Freudian psychoanalyst is almost comically condescending and comically, projective, and pays no real attention to the child at all. So I think it's a really important point that ego-based psychology, and this is why Lacan as a psychoanalytic philosopher is so important, is because Lacan saw this so clearly, how the egos of psychoanalysis kind of reified the opposite of what Freud was talking about.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think if I may continue for a short comment here, I think that the ego psychology is something that people are relying on to provide some kind of clear model for proper behavior when they are distressed psychologically. So ego psychology presupposes as a principle consistency for the subject. And the way that I see Freud criticizing potentially this type of approach is that this ego psychology relies on sympathy, of relating through one's ego. And what Freud is explicitly against here, and what he's mainly criticized for in later post-Freudian movements, is the kind of coldness. Freud is saying that experience itself speaks against this type of affective approach, since he's saying that this type of affective approach is the most destructive feeling that one can have against uncovering the unconscious of the patient. And he gives many reasons and arguments, but yeah.
I want to make a comment, if I may. What both of you have been saying, I think, really frames something that I wanted to say really, really well. And in order to do so, I want to engage a little bit in some wordplay. In Freud's text, he mentions that French motto, "Je le pensais," and it's interesting that it should be translated "I dressed it." That is like dressing a wound. But in Cadell's presentation, he actually used the word "address," which I think is very interesting kind of slip. And I want to kind of come back to that in a second, because what really struck me about when I read that is I had just read in Lacan's Seminar 23 him using that very same word when he's talking about the body image in the imaginary. And he's engaging in his typical kind of wordplay, and he says, je le pense, I put a dressing on it, that is, je le fais pense, I turned it into a paunch, therefore, je le suis, I suffer it. And what he's talking about is that in our attempts to create consistency in our body image in the imaginary order, we end up engaging in mendacity. And he's playing on the wordplay there with between sense and lying. We end up creating a paunch, a belly, something that is we get it wrong, méprise, and therefore we have a contempt then of our body, a mépris. And so in this attempt to create consistency in the ego, the imaginary, we end up getting it wrong. We end up creating a paunch, something that we suffer. And I think this is, where the Freudian analysis can take place in finding in the real where there is an imaginary paunch, an imaginary error, and thus it is only in addressing, to come back to Cadell's slip, is in addressing that the analyst can then begin to properly dress the wound. And so what both of you were saying in regard to the failure of ego psychology, I think keys in very well to what Lacan was saying in Seminar 23 here, in that it is precisely in the failure of the ego to create consistency in the body image that can point out where there is a paunch, a symptom, something that is where there is some suffering in the analysan, where then the analyst can come in and be able to address it and then dress the wound. I hope that made sense.
I would like to ask.
Excellent sense, yeah.
I would like to ask Eric, when you are talking about imaginary error, you are thinking on that body without organs? Okay. Now, what I try to introduce, if I can, is my confession to you as a physician that worked a lot of time as an expert, as a medical expert, in which the suffering person, the client, invested me with a lot of power. I was the expert, I was a little god who had the power to be in possession of a knowledge about the other. And he addressed as a child, as an adapted child, that needs a parent more or less permissive to solve his problem. And after years and years in which I identified and I enjoyed this position of power, I got tired and I had to confront my own symptoms to understand that I'm not a little god and that I have to change the paradigm or to make it larger. So I began to be interested not only in scientific medicine, in which I was very well trained, a lot of years, and I became interested in phenomenology, in psychoanalysis, in mystics, in all kinds of stuff. And what I want to ask you, and I thank you, and I'm very thankful for this opportunity to be able to have a dialogue about what I will say now and what I will ask you now. What do you think? Do we need and do we experience now a changing of this paradigm of the scientific medicine paradigm to another paradigm in which medical physicians have to change their attitude and their discourse from a master discourse to another kind of discourse? Because it's about that. It's about the fact that we are not masters. We have to realize that we physicians, experts, are not masters. We do not know. We are supposed to know, but we do not know. So that's why it's important to become from an expert to become a transparent screen, letting the other, the analysand or the suffering person, to transform into something else. So the person who is suffering, if we are transparent, if we are not identified with some knowledge or with our ego, then the person who suffers and who comes in front of us with the symptom is able to see through our transparency something else, something maybe that is a gap, confronting a gap maybe, or just some anxiety, emotion, states of mind, whatever. Because at the end, I think it's exactly what you said. It's not about ego psychology. It's not about object relation. It's about intersubjectivity, but it's not about two identified split subjects, but it's about two or one unconscious, two unconsciousnesses that are intertwined and are one unconscious. That's the question, that in this relation, in a way, me and the other and me, we have the chance to create a space in which the unconscious reveals itself from itself and has a healing force. So I think we have to shift the paradigm of medicine and of approaching the symptom from an object that is the diagnosis from DSM or whatever, to another paradigm in which the symptom becomes a singular one and we do not judge it. We just are present, transparent, in a free flowing state, in a state of neutral courtesy that is very difficult to achieve and to manifest. And then the healing and revelation, let's say like that, is able to manifest and to be observed.
You know, to answer that, I think I would point to something Lacan said. I think it's in Seminar 10 in the first session, where he says, and he precisely points out what is the difference between psychoanalysis and science, scientific medicine particularly, is that psychoanalysis is concerned with one thing and one thing only, and that is the subject. That is the subject of the unconscious. It's not concerned with universals. It's not concerned with universal, you know, principles of science, where we're, you know, in science, through the scientific method, you're trying to come up with universal principles of the way that the world works, the universe works, the body works. The analyst is concerned with one thing only, and that is the subject. And here's the thing that Freud understood, that Lacan understood, is that the subject reflects the world around him or her. And as the world changes, as culture changes, civilization changes, the subject will change in its symptoms. The symptom changes. And this is what I was thinking in regard to that second paper, is all of these, this catalog of dream images that Freud puts together needs to be updated. We need a new catalog of the dream image in regard to our current world, our current civilization. Because naturally, in our day, an overcoat will not be a proper symbol for a man in a woman's dream. We're going to need something a little, perhaps a little different. Who knows what that would be? And that's I think a good handle on precisely the job of the analyst is not to apply some universal, DSM type of scientific paradigm on the subject, but to allow the subject to, through the subject's symptom, to speak, to say something about our world. As I've said before, the symptom speaks. And so, yeah, I think precisely what you're saying is very true. And that is the job of the analyst is not to apply some, pre-thought out universal, but to always be trying to keep step with the subject. And so there is, just as Freud kind of mentioned this, this reciprocity between the two unconsciousnesses, the analyst is just as much a part of the process with, in terms of himself almost being an analysan. And that is why most analysts are, they've all gone through an analysis, and many of them are, ongoing in analysis. And Freud mentions that in his text, that, anyone practicing psychoanalysis most definitely should go through analysis, him or herself, because if you don't overcome your own complexes, you can't begin to see properly other people's and be able to address in an unbiased fashion. So I think that's exactly right. That our concern in analysis is the subject and the subject alone, and not any concern for a broader universal theory. And this is why Lacan himself, as much as we get attached to Lacanian theory, and I think this is probably the error of the more philosophical approach to Lacanian theory, the Zizekian type approach, perhaps, is that it gets too caught up with a particular phase of Lacan's theory, or even a Freudian theory. Whether that's the graph of desire or the sexual non-relation or whatever, because Lacan himself was able to adapt over time his theory, and his theories change over the course of his nearly 30-year career of doing the seminars, to where at the end of his career he was just fiddling with knots because he couldn't really even express what he wanted to say regarding the subject. So I think that ability to adapt to the subject is really key. And I think Freud understood that, and that's apparent in the text.
I'd also want to just say quickly about your last point about Lacan, is that Lacan would always criticize Freudians for being uninnovative and basically mimicking Freud. in some sense, not really saying anything new. And I think in some sense, the same can paradoxically be said about some Lacanians, or like some aspects of the Lacanian community, that they end up simply mimicking Lacan and like you're saying, getting too caught up with a certain phase of Lacan's career and just repeating and repeating things that Lacan said, for example. And maybe that's why Zizek kind of sticks out, because I think Zizek can't be sort of faulted for that in any way. I think he brings, to be precise, like, and this is sort of referencing the beginning of Lacan's écrit, is, you know, Zizek really brings his own style to the table. He really brings his own, like, he really is something different. Like, he's not just simply repeating Lacan. So, but at the same time, it's obvious that he's worked through Lacan. So in the same way, like with my, when I think about my own sort of creative development, I think it's really important to be able to work through thinkers like Freud and Lacan and Zizek, and at the same time, sort of reflect very deeply on how one wants to create from that working through, to bring one's own style to the table, and not simply get caught up in sort of the symbolic webs of a historical figure.
I would like to add to Alexander's question another counter question. Well, my question would be that, isn't this exactly what I was asking just a moment ago? Namely that in Freud himself, we already have a criticism of the position of the supposed expert knowledge on the psyche. So this supposed paradigm shift that we are encountering, it is not something new. It's already in place when we read Freud. And
yes,
this is perhaps one of the main premises of where Zizek's whole philosophy starts. He says that it's not just this Ptolemaic like addition. It's a genuine paradigm shift in the Kuhnian sense of the term.
Yes, Mika, of course, you're right. It starts with Freud in medicine, but you know, that's the beauty that in psychoanalysis you can be loyal to your master only by being unloyal. That's the beauty. That's the relation between these singularities that are transmitting from one to the other something or nothing. You're right, but in the same time, Freud, of course, he is a pioneer. He is the first. There is a culture before Freud and a culture after Freud. But in the same time, both Freud and Lacan, they were physicians. And from this point of view, Freud was still, maybe the word is too heavy, prisoner. He was too identified, but it's normal, I understand, with the culture, with the medical culture of his time. So he was identified with all those theories of biology and so on. So he had to play a little that paradigm. But of course, in the same time, he was humbled and he gave a voice to all these so-called hysteric women, suffering women. So he was able to put himself on a not knowing position and to make the shift from a master discourse to an analytic discourse. That was very important. Just to listen the other, to listen the symptom, that was very important. And he discovered this gap between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. And from this point of view, because of this gap, he is indeed accepting that idealizing some paradigm, if it's a scientific one, it's a mistake. So he was able to be Socratic, and so often in what he's writing, and mostly in his last years, he's saying, I made a mistake, I don't know. Mm-hmm. That's so important, this humbleness, this saying, I don't know. I made mistakes. You know, I have my own symptom. I have my own incapacities of being a little God, as a lot of experts.
Yeah,
know.
It's almost like in the later period, Freud started really to apply psychoanalysis to psychoanalysis itself. And in this paper, I think that the key proposition might be that the doctor should be opaque to his patients, and like a mirror should show them nothing but what is shown to him. And I think that this is the crucial break with Freud. And he is in here implying a critique of the affective approach to curing the patient or curing the mentally ill person with some type of presupposed knowledge about the proper behavior or being in the world. He is criticizing this type of affective approach, the type of like relating personally or trying to be frank, or even, to use a critical term here, to be authentic. He's saying that this verges on suggestive methods, and one could say that it's a regression in the scientific like progression. It's relating to models of behavior that don't achieve the crucial break in psychoanalysis. And Freud says that this type of suggestion achieves nothing towards uncovering the unconscious, since, as we have learned, unconscious is, in the Freudian context, always something that accompanies strong repression, strong resistances. So this just suggesting to be like frank or affective towards the patients, he's saying, arguing that this encourages the patients to be insatiable about the analyst. The analyst becomes a source of knowledge or a source of even enjoyment for the narcissistic image of the patient, one could say. So he says that the resolution of transference is made difficult, if not impossible, by this type of approach. And what the doctor should be is just this cold mirror. And it's really difficult, I would suppose, since I'm not an analyst, to just do this type of gesture, since there is the call or the demand that Lacan speaks about in the first seminar extensively from the patient. And the call or the demand is always a type of a splitting within the subject. And it presupposes a meaning to be like, one could say, a type of archaeology of the meaning of the unconscious.
I even think this distinction here between whether or not an analyst can be a type of cold mirror, or whether or not the analyst feels kind of an inner provocation to engage in processes of emotional transference, is actually a good measure for the inner complexes that you still have to overcome in some sense. I know in myself, when I'm sort of doing something similar to an analytic process with someone who I have no previous relation or effective relation with, it's quite easy for me to be a type of cold mirror. And then when I'm involved in situations that in some sense require analysis, but they're involving people who I'm very close with intimately, it's extraordinarily difficult to impossible to be this cold mirror, which probably says something about, of course, my own affective history and my own emotional history. But there's a way in which I feel like this is a good guidepost in some sense to what Freud is calling analytic purification. Because if I could be in some, because the paradox is that when you're the cold mirror, to me, I actually don't think it's very cold. I actually think it's very beautiful. Like, I actually think the cold mirror is beautiful. But like, in some sense, if I can be a cold mirror universally in some sense, meaning in relation to every subject, I think that would be the best guidepost to, again, what Freud's calling analytic purification.
I would just say a little thing and then I will stop, excuse me. The fact that both Freud and Lacan were physicians and they were trained as physicians, I'm sure they had a unique approach to a unique client. So because by practicing medicine and by having a master who is initiating you in this, you start to understand that it's very important and it's a very unique relation between patient and physician. So there is not a recipe. There is no recipe. And both of them were able of doing it. So if it's a mirror, if you do not have to be a mirror, you do not have to be transparent, you do not have to be cold or to be nice. You just have a feedback from the singularity that is suffering in front of you, and from itself you know how you have to be, or you don't know how you have to be. So it's singularity. It's singularity. It's from itself. It's not a recipe. That's very important, because you have to be authentic in a way. But also letting an empty space. And Lacan said, le nom du père, le nom du père. This means, in a way, you have to let the other having the feeling that he's right or that he's convincing you maybe in a way. It's very important not to be identified with your knowledge. That's important. To be present there and open in a singular way, in a singular way. And what I just want to add, and then I finish, the cultural time, the culture paradigm in which Lacan developed his psychoanalysis was marked by linguistics, and we can see this. Now it's something else. Who knows what will come? But what's very important, what Lacan gave us, is this system of cartel, because the cartel keeps alive his tradition and transmission, and is the solution of not transforming psychoanalysis in a dead science. That's very important, because through cartel, it's changing and adapting, and everyone has his chance to manifest. So that's, in my opinion, the heritage that Lacan left us with.
Yeah, and I would like to say that it's really interesting to see always how this assumption of non-recipe or assumption of the position of the empty space, it turns into assumption of knowledge in like a microsecond. In almost an instant, one is speaking about authenticity or supposed knowledge about the proper ideal way of behavior, and it's almost instantaneous usually. In a way, there is an inherent dialectics of knowledge and non-knowledge that needs to be always encountered again, and it's accompanied by strong repressions or strong resistances. But yeah, it's an interesting dialectics.
Well, even beyond that, I think beyond this notion of the recipe, and I love that phrase that you used, Alexandra, the identification with knowledge. It is the notion of the hypothesis itself that accompanies the scientific method. And Freud even mentions in section D of that paper that cases which are devoted from the first to scientific purpose and are treated accordingly suffer in their outcome. And so if you come in to analysis with some kind of hypothesis, some kind of scientific hypothesis that's already polluting the analytic process. And so we can see here the difference between analysis and science itself, and we can see how science, even in its attempt to be unbiased and to be objective, ends up bringing in so much of the subjectivity of the scientist, in that they come in with a presupposed knowledge even in the form of a hypothesis. All of this in this paper, what we're talking about, it reminds me, and maybe we talked about it before, that anecdote from Lacan's analysis of a woman, Suzanne Hummel, who was a Polish woman who was a child during World War II, and she mentions that she always gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning. And then she casually mentions that it was at 5 o'clock in the morning that the Gestapo would come in and round up the Jews in her town. And Lacan jumps up out of his chair and goes over to her and gently touches her cheek with his hand, which she interpreted as the Gestapo, a gesture on the skin. And that was a very powerful thing that he did that enabled her to work through some of her symptoms. But that kind of interpretation or intervention cannot come out of any kind of presupposition, any kind of theory, any kind of prior attention. If Lacan was deep in thought, focusing on something that she had said prior to that, he would have totally missed this off the hand remark about I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and so on. And he would not have been able to draw that connection between the Gestapo and the Gestapo. And so that kind of thing is precisely what Freud is getting at here in this paper, I think.
It's really interesting to think about this reversal between science and analysis. And I think in some sense that's one of the most attractive dimensions in reading Lacan's work, is because he does such a good job, for example, in his famous paper about truth, I think goes to the core of this as well. I wanted to for a moment reflect a little bit on, I think, primarily what Alexandra was bringing up about this transformation of the scientist and the master discourse, the scientist as the subject supposed to know, because in some sense, especially in medical science, I feel like what's imminent is that the scientist has to confront that they are not the subject supposed to know, because you see in a lot of cases with personalized medicine or with big data or artificial intelligence where people are going to be starting to treat the master's discourse as the machine itself. Like the master's discourse is going to be transforming from the doctor or the physician to the personalized AI that will have your bio data and that will have your entire history. And then that will be the new master's discourse. And then I wonder if a similar process could be at work in psychiatry or psychology eventually, where you have repositories of sort of everything, like I think Yuval Noah Harari talks about this a lot, where he talks about how he gives the example of his own realization that he's gay. He says that if in the future, the machines would have known I was gay before I knew I was gay, because they would have been monitoring my eye movements where I'm looking or checking out guys on the street or something like that, or like, you know, my browser history, where I've been going in the late at night or something like that. But just that the master's discourse is becoming the discourse of the machine, that the machine is becoming the new master and our new relationship with that, and that we as subjects are all sort of accepting a analytic position in some sense as subjects who don't know. I don't know if that's sort of relevant, but I thought it might be interesting to situate some of these ideas in the context of what's happening in modern medical science and our position as subjects in relationship to it.
Could it be that this is really interesting comment that you made? I think it's crucial. But what comes to my mind is that could it be that people are more easily receptive or suggestive to this mechanistic master because they somehow presuppose that the machine is the whole machine is somehow more objective, even though there is somebody always operating behind it?
Yeah, it's interesting to note. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I think the corollary there is the university discourse. And I apologize for the deep Lacanian theory here, but you know, the corollary to the master's discourse is the university discourse, where the master signifier is under the bar and in the position of truth, right? So in the university discourse, the master is kind of hidden. We don't notice it, right? But it's there. It's actually the truth that's speaking, and what it's producing, the product, the surplus jouissance, is the subject itself. And I think this is the position that we get in this discourse, is that we go to the doctor and the doctor says, this is your diagnosis. And we say, okay, right? You know, or you could think about it even in the sense of like going to an AA meeting in the United States. You go to Alcoholics Anonymous or any of the anonymous, and what do? You stand up and you say, hi, my name is so-and-so and I'm an addict. You do this identification with something that's presupposed for you, this notion of being an addict or having a certain diagnosis. It's all presupposed for you, all already there for you, and all you have to do is identify with it, and that is you're within the university discourse at that point. And so it's just reproducing the subject in each case.
I have a question.
Okay, Alexandra, and then Jayati after Alexandra.
But I try to put this question from not knowing. And I don't know. That's why I'm asking. What if I'm not identified with no diagnosis? What if I don't know? And in the same time, I do not accept that you know about me. If I'm psychotic, perverse, or maybe neurotic, if I just don't know and I just don't want to know, and I want to relate with somebody who does not know. So we just enjoy our intersubjectivity without knowing something, in the sense that we just do not identify with a label. We are,
well, I think it's interesting that
experiencing in a space in between egos. What do you think? Is this?
I think it's interesting that Freudian analysis begins with, you know, Breuer and Freud. They're treating Anna O and these other hysterical women precisely because their symptoms did not fit with any diagnostic criteria at the time. The doctors didn't know what to do with them. And so that's where Freud and Breuer came in and developed their theory. And so I think what you're saying is exactly where psychoanalysis fits in this. You know, it's interesting that the psychoanalytic categories of diagnosis, neurosis, psychosis, and so on, are not scientific DSM categories, and necessarily so. But even beyond that, to what you're saying is this notion of the difference between the real unconscious and the transferential unconscious, where the subject in analysis will develop symptoms in the course of analysis that speak directly to the analyst. You know, the subject will have dreams that are meant directly for the analyst. So there's this dialogue between the unconscious that is specific to the analytical setting. And it's the analyst has to understand that and be able to configure that transferential relationship in order to get behind it to the real unconscious. And so, yeah, that's a very crucial dynamic in
Jayati, you had your hand raised. Would you like to say something?
Yeah. So, here we are looking at physician, patient, doctor, patient, analyst, analyzer, and the relationship over there. I can, from my own field, I can think of two parallels which can draw a lot from this particular article. One is the teacher and the taught relationship, and second is the ethnographer and the field. So when anthropologist goes to the field, and over there one can find the similar kind of authority, this kind of which is generally there. They take a diagnostic approach. There are already research methodology which is defined, and one has to be very skeptic about all those research methodology, because that doesn't allow the field. So when I also go to the field, if I am too tight on my research methods, my field will not really open up to me the way Freud is talking about his own patients. So I was just thinking, I was reading something that in this particular anthropologist, he talks about this importance of vulnerability, that how it's extremely important to be vulnerable when you go to the field, and something that Kedl said in the beginning, that it's important to allow, so that we don't intellectualize, and to let everything come up the way it is coming. Only then you can capture, only then you can understand the patient. From anthropology, I would say the same one can see even in an anthropologist relationship to the field. If you are already full of ideas, then in Bourdieu's language, it will be logic of practice and practice of logic, which he puts up very interestingly. Then your own mind already has logic inside it, and you are just putting it in the practice. And in contrast to that, he would talk about in a logic of field, that every field has certain kind of logic. It's very important for anthropologists, for sociologists, for ethnographers to be open towards the field and to just absorb themselves and then go back later on and the same things, like not take notes when you are in the field, take notes when you go later on. So there were a lot of parallels that I could draw after reading this article. And I think it's very important for anthropologists also to pay attention to what psychoanalysis has to say.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the really important. Does anyone have a response or something they'd like to add to what Jayati's saying here?
Well, in connection, maybe to more to Alexander's point earlier, I'm reminded of like this example from literature that Jordan Peterson likes to use of Dostoevsky's Underground Man. It's really a funny way to frame this hysterical problem, since when we think about some type of like machine that would know everything about me, or some type of determinist universe in some earlier metaphysics, this Underground Man poses a problem that if there was such a case, that there was some kind of a machine or some type of like a determinist universe or God or whatever that would know everything about me, I would purposely go insane, completely bonkers, and do everything to destroy this presupposition of my own knowledge. So it's something inherent to human minds to have this type of hysteria, that we cannot know everything about ourselves. Knowledge and truth are in this way disconnected always.
Yeah, I think just to echo that point, because I love Dostoevsky's Underground Man, I always like the double meaning of 2 + 2 = 5 as a good formula for the unconscious that rebels against the deterministic framing of the universe and our mathematics without subjectivity. Of course, when we use the frame 2 + 2 = 5, we're often referring to the 1984 big other of a political or social system that is imposing a certain truth, or imposing a certain ideological knowledge as truth. Whereas I think the 2 + 2 = 5 as the subject of the unconscious is it's a different perspective, but that much more powerful in some way. Javier, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that hit me was when that quote that Freud said with the dressing the wounds and God taking care of them. I'm a nurse in the Army, and it just really struck me how kind of similar that process is, where there's this gap between there's the doctor, the patient, but then I'm the kind of mediator between the two. And there's always a conflict of what the patient is saying and then what the doctor's saying. And the nurse has to kind of sort that through. And it's always a difficult process because the doctor, you can say, is very cold sometimes because it's categories, symptoms, this is the care plan, and my job as a nurse is to follow that. But of course, when you run into conflict is when you start talking to the patient, and the patient has conflicts with what the care plan is and how to proceed with that. And so there's always this dialectical process going on, and it's always, at least what I've noticed is that I'm very skeptical when a patient is so, I guess, agreeable to the symptom or the diagnosis. I've met a lot of people where it's like they're very much ready to accept something that's wrong with them because they want something to fill that gap of, I don't know what's wrong with me. But then also I noticed that when I take care of people, they like taking the less resistive path. That's like the biggest thing. And you can tell when a patient wants to get out of there, you get the sense that they're hiding something. They don't want to confront something, so they're trying to get out of there. And then there's the patients that want to stay there. And that is also the less resistant way for them to confront the thing that would get them out of there. And so like my job as a nurse is to respond to both of those ways. Sometimes if the patient is too dependent, my job is to kind of just ask them simple questions. What can you do today? Can you brush your teeth today? Can you walk today? Can you walk a little bit farther today? I'm supposed to expose what you can do, and let's see what you can do today. Because sometimes patients like to sit there and they'll be like, well, I just had a surgery, I can't walk. I'll be like, well, let's see what you can do. If you can't do it, if it hurts, then we'll stop. And let's just go. Let's see what are the limitations here. And most patients don't want to explore the limitations. So I think that was the things that came to mind when Freud was talking about this, where I'm kind of just, we're pointing at something for the patient, and then the cure kind of will, I guess, take care of itself, if you want to look at it that way. I recently read a book called Becoming Freud by Adam Phillips, where Adam Phillips quotes Freud saying that, and I guess in his later years, saying that psychoanalysis is like secular pastoral work, which that was really interesting because Adam Phillips exploits this idea where Freud doesn't want psychoanalysis to become a Jewish science. Yet it becomes Freud's way of making something a little bit religious-like, but then at the same time not religious-like, by avoiding his Jewishness, and yet at the same time all the people that were within the psychoanalysis were Jewish at the time. And I found that very interesting because the listening aspect that Freud said that was so important, it always reminds me of like this confession, right? Where you go to that priest in Catholicism, and there's that wall, and you're supposed to just say what you did wrong, what you did that no one is willing to hear immediately. And another thing about the being a mirror, I recently come across R.D. Laing. He's an interesting figure, where one of the captivating moments that everybody remembers about R.D. Laing is that there was a patient that she was, I guess, schizophrenic, and she wasn't talking, and they had to do all sorts of sort of things to, I guess, keep her going. And R.D. Laing, literally, there's a moment where she's taking off her clothes, and R.D. Laing takes off his clothes in response. And so they're both naked on this like bench. And for the first time, she speaks out of this reflection. And I thought it was such a literal mirroring that R.D. Laing did, because she was just taking off her clothes naked, she hasn't spoken to anybody in, I guess, I don't know how long, but R.D. Laing mimicking her was actually the first time that she spoke. And that was something that really, and this was something that was relatively unconventional. It still would be really unconventional and unethical today, probably. But that's what kind of hit me when we're talking about this being a mirror in some sense. But yeah, that's all I have to say.
Okay, we have there's a lot there to respond to. Let's keep some of that in mind, but the Mika and then Alexandra.
Yeah, thank you for your perspective. That was really valuable to hear, really concrete. But this is not so much a criticism, but just a specification. When Freud is discussing these quotes, that I only dressed the wounds, but God healed or cured him. Freud is saying that something like this needs to be embodied in our psychoanalysis. He is not asserting any kind of theology here. He always was an atheist. And what, to my mind, what this quote speaks about is a need of a third, so that it's not any kind of like two-body psychology that he is trying to develop there. And this brings to mind the point that Lacan likes to repeat, that what psychoanalysis reveals is firstly that ego is an imaginary or even illusory phenomenon, and that there is something in man that speaks, something that calls forth, or yeah. And about the mirror, it's something that one could perhaps play on a lot. What does the mirror imply in a psychoanalytic session, since there are probably some restraints on using this type of mirror-like activity. But what came to my mind about the mirror is that what Lacan gives as a formula of what he's doing for the analysand is that he's giving back the message that the analysand gives, but only in an inverted form. But these are just short comments that came to my mind, and I would like to say that it was really valuable to hear the perspective that you had about the concrete action of encountering this call.
Okay.
Okay.
Javier, just a sec, Alexandra. Javier, did you want to respond to that, or?
I mean, yeah, I'll respond. I mean, yeah, I thought that was good. I mean, absolutely, I agree with your saying. I didn't mean it to make it like theological, but yeah, you're correct. I mean, Freud wanted a more. Adam Phillips put it perfectly. He's like, Freud was in between two worlds, a world that was breaking tradition, and then a world that was becoming more secular. And I think the significance of Freud is that Freud was coming up with a secular language, and that was psychoanalysis. And so this need for a third, or something other than the, theological language that we were so accustomed to at the time for Freud's time. I think you're correct. I agree with that. And I was just kind of just using an example of how there's similarities, but you know,
yeah. And I would say that this need for a third, it's not something that we could relate to need for bigger other. I think that this third would be something that Lacan later speaks about, the object small a.
Okay, so that I don't know if Javier, the object small is object cause of desire. Alexander, did you want to, or
yes.
Go ahead.
First of all, thank you that Kader, that you cited Dostoevsky, I think.
Mika first, and then I just followed him.
There's a slip.
Because when it's about Dostoevsky, we can keep in mind that the idiot was a prince, was in a way a hero, but in the same time he was hospitalized. And yeah, okay. I want to ask Mika if, and to thank him that by his observation, he introduced the, let's say, danger of transhumanism, and he raised the question of freedom of the subject, if he agrees. Then for Giotti, thanks that you make me remember of an anthropologist, William Sachs, which I love, and I had the honor to be present while he had a conference. And when he explains and described so nice about his experience in India with the untouchables, those the caste that was so low that you did not touch them. And he explained about the differences between the neurocognitive psychiatry and the way in which these untouchables were able to deal with so-called psychotic symptoms, in which the healer of the community used his way, his traditional way. And this William Sachs professor, he said that he lived with them. He needed years to detach from his identifications and presuppositions and training as a psychiatrist or anthropologist in modern science paradigm. And at the end, he was able to learn their language, and he had to let go all this knowledge in order to become open to the untouchables. And it's very interesting what you said, Giotti, how this danger is of knowing, of having the master discourse, is always an obstacle toward the other, toward the radical otherness. And also for Javier, yes, the nurse is an interface between, is the third in this very interesting relation between physician and patient. And I would like to ask you, because in a way you described an ambivalent feeling, what to do. I don't know exactly how to react, how to play my role. Do you think that maybe the client or the patient with his symptom has also a secondary benefit from this symptom? Because at the end, the symptom is a surrogate for the objet A, for the little objet A. So it's about pain and pleasure in the same time. So I have my symptom, I suffer, but on the other side, I need it. I stay attached to it because it gives me something I need, a pleasure. So it's about le petit objet in a way. And then it's so delicate to know and to play this role in between two extreme positions. So thank you for doing it. It's not easy at all.
With regard to my, sorry if I may say this, I would say that I wasn't so much, maybe I was bringing forth the needs for freedom, but I was trying to point towards this hysterical propensity or hysterical disposition inherent to psychological constitution of man, and it's possible to say that there is this type of like possibility of inherent contradiction in every conscious human being, or maybe it is only our presupposition from this type of discourse. But the type of freedom that would accompany this type of like possibility of contradicting oneself would be a freedom of just eternal sliding from one object to another, just choosing one packet of say cigarettes or one cookie brand from another. And the type of freedom that I would philosophically keep as the most important is the freedom to just change your own presuppositions or the very structure of the situation. And it's more difficult. And well, is our focus on really on consistency, keeping consistent? No, it's really attention or choiceless awareness and noticing the real or the crack in the discourse of the patient. And it's only by working through these kind of cracks then that we can start to develop or construct a more free place for ourselves in the world. But it's not eternal freedom or this type of like eternal merging with the one or whatever, the type of like mystical garbage that gets thrown around when we start to speak about these issues. It's just a freedom to live and to work and so on. It's not some kind of ultimate absolute position.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, especially the this, I was talking about this today, like we know the neoliberal horizon of freedom as the choice to pick Coke or Pepsi, McDonald's or Burger King. Like it's the very horizon of freedom is already been determined.
Yeah, and it's too hysterical.
Well, I also like this point you keep emphasizing of this inherent hysterical aspect of the society of the psyche, as this rebellion against consistency and this rebellion against sort of the having projections sort of presupposed upon you, like for example, like the DSM categorization system. Like that the hysteric inherently rebels against this sort of like a priori. I think that this is obviously this is the core of psychoanalysis and analytic work, and sort of the clue, I think, to psychoanalysis being able to study the subject in the way that Eric was describing earlier. Did any of you want to respond to Jayati or Javier? Did you want to respond to what Alexander was saying? If not,
Yeah, I'll respond. I mean, I think what's interesting is that the patient and doctor reaction is always the same, in the sense that the doctor swears that he knows and the patient swears that he knows. And the nurse always comes into a situation where it's two people claiming that they both know exactly what's wrong with them. And sometimes I see nurses will do the same. It will be like a third person that says that they claim that they know. And I try to distance myself away from those things because oftentimes you will deal with the doctor's projections, and then the patient will project, and it's really interesting because the nurse will get both end of the projections as a messenger from the dialogue between the doctor and the patient. The doctor will express his frustration onto you, and then the patient will express his frustration onto you. And then the crazy part is, where does the nurse express their frustration? Because you can't do it to the patient because that's relatively unethical, and then you can't really do it to the doctor because you're about to make your life a lot more difficult if you do that. And so there's this, you could almost say, like, I understand Freud's idea of like a coldness in some sense, but it's not, it's like, I think it's exactly what you said. It's like not really cold. It's not really cold, but yeah, the interaction is something that is, I think, philosophically not really discussed in some, I mean, I think it is discussed, but I think most people don't look at the interaction really thoroughly enough, at least day-to-day ordinary people that don't talk about this stuff. It's a very interesting interaction that goes on between the doctor, the nurse, and the patient. There's that trifold there, and it's never an easy answer. Yeah, I can always say, like, I just never know, really. Do you follow the plan the doctor gives? Listen to the patient, alter the plan. Sometimes you have to tell the doctor recommendations, and that's all you can do. And then you have to recommend to the patient what they can do to get out of the situation. It just all depends. But yeah, I have seen exactly what you're talking about. There's an interesting example. It's kind of humorous and kind of dark, but there is a patient that actually, you could tell that he loved suffering. And he would always say, "Oh, I want to die. I just want to die." And then finally, one of the nurses that I was shadowing, she said, "Okay, well then die." Okay. She said that. Yeah. And I at first, when you heard that, you're like, "Oh my God, are you allowed to say that?" But I felt that it was one of those things that needed to be said because he just enjoyed thoroughly his suffering and incapacity. And of course, this isn't applicable to everybody. There's people that do really feel that they want to die, but the way this man was saying it and the way the nurse responded, it broke his just constant loathing of desiring for suffering. And once he realized that she wasn't going to put up with it anymore, he just he stopped. Yeah. She's like, "Okay, then die."
It's fantastic. I can't help but notice that I know I bring it up too much, but there was a passage in Osho where he does the same thing. Someone is kept on saying, I want to die, I want to kill myself, and he's like, "All right, let's go. Let's do it." Eric, you want to?
Yeah, just in conjunction with some of the things that Javier has been saying, and I think drawing also on what Mika was saying, is something that Lacan says quite often, is that there is no big other of the big other. And I think this pertains a lot to the position of the analyst as the big other in the transferential relationship, as the subject supposed to know. And it's very important that the analyst does not expose this notion of that there is no, or that he himself has a big other. Because when the big other displays evidence of that it has a big other, then it no longer is the big other. In other words, the other of the other is the signifier of the barred other, if that makes sense. Whenever the big other shows evidence of itself having a big other, then it ceases to become the big other, ceases to play that role. It shows its own lack.
Oh, perhaps.
So,
sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to give the image that came to my mind was the relationship between Darth Vader and the Emperor. It's like as soon as as just because you're in the Star Wars ship, as soon as Darth Vader has the Emperor, Darth Vader kind of loses his function as the ultimate evil.
Yeah, well,
So
that's
there's
what
hysteria.
enables him to become it's what enables him to become a sympathetic character. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
And so what Lacan says in Seminar 23, he says in regard to this notion of there being no other of the other, is what the analyst has to do is in not exposing his own lack of knowledge, is what the analyst does is to suture together, he uses this word suture, the imaginary and the symbolic. And he's thinking here about the Borromean knot, and I won't go into all of that, but what he says here is it is a splice between the imaginary and the unconscious knowledge, which is the effect of the signifier, the symbolic order. And it is in this conjunction between the imaginary and the symbolic is where we get meaning or sense. And this is where Lacan is coming in the later part of his theory, in the period of the Borromean knot, is this overlap between the rings of the imaginary and the symbolic. It's where they coincide, and like you could think of like a Venn diagram. There's two circles that overlap. It's in that overlap of the imaginary and the symbolic, in the conjunction of where the symbolic, in terms of the unconscious knowledge that comes out in the course of analysis, and how it impacts our imaginary consistency, the consistency of our body image. That is the job of the analyst, is to create that suture. And so it's not, this position of this, the discourse of the master, because, and we know this from Hegel, the discourse of the master only shows the lack of the master. It shows that the master himself is the servile consciousness. And that is where we see the signifier of the barred other, that there is no other of the other. And so if analysis is to work, then the analyst has to make sure that exposure of the subject supposed to know doesn't happen. And he does that simply by bringing these two parts of the subject and suturing them together. And that's analysis in a nutshell.
Yeah, and also, if I remember right, in this connection, Lacan also says that by the same stroke, the analyst brings another suture or another splicing between the symbolic and phallic jouissance. And this he writes as jouissance, playing on the very notion of jouissance, referring to hearing, aware, and eye and sense meaning. So that's what gets place is hearing meaning.
Yeah.
I'm tempted to ask a question in relationship to the function of to Eric or Miko or anyone else who this resonates with. So in this place and the function of the analyst as this conjunction between the imaginary and the symbolic, specifically where you state where we get meaning and sense, in the context of what's being called in some online intellectual circles, the meaning crisis or the sense-making crisis. This idea that we're in a meaning or a sense-making crisis, that what would be your interpretation of this on a sociological level?
Well, my immediate response has always been that this is a crisis of language. It's a crisis of not having, or maybe a crisis of displaying a lack in language. And it's only solved with language.
That's very interesting because, like, just if I can repeat you here, that the meaning or sense-making crisis is a crisis of language displaying a lack in language. Where I get self-reflective about this is that in my own language and in my own philosophical creation, I find myself talking about things like a philosophy of lack, or talking about, you know, absentials, talking about, you know, just that's sort of where I guess my unconscious spontaneously has started to interpret.
Yeah, if I may add here, I would say that it's an ambiguous way of saying what I was giving. In one sense, one could say that language cannot give material for my being. This would be like the intuitive approach. But I would read it as saying that I don't have a place to articulate my meaning. So maybe they are just searching for analysis.
To answer that question from my perspective, I'm thinking of something that Lacan says in Seminar 19. I think it's probably the most important thing he ever said, that wisdom is the knowledge of jouissance. And it is in that suture of the symbolic and the imaginary that creates sense. What that is, I think, is precisely the knowledge of our jouissance. That what analysis should bring out in that meaning, what is this meaning that you're talking about, this crisis of meaning and such? It is nothing but knowledge of our jouissance. And it's knowing, okay, this is how I am getting enjoyment, this perverse, transgressive enjoyment. This is how, you know, unconsciously how I am, you know, trying to get jouissance. And it's that is the knowledge that we're after, really.
Gee,
that is
so good.
The aim of analysis.
I feel like this is so good. Like, I feel like this is so important. Like that, that. Of course, I mean, so like I want to situate this in the context of, you know, why I feel like this is so exciting to think about. Is that, like, in the specific media ecology, I often sort of relate in or engage with, like, I can name specific sources, like, for example, like a platform like Rebel Wisdom is specifically talking about a sense-making crisis, or a platform like the Stoa, or like John Vervaeke's Meaning Crisis series. You know, all of these outlets, I think, are basically, you know, unconsciously striving towards a knowledge of jouissance, but at the same time, I perceive in them such a resistance to a knowledge of jouissance. So I think that
exactly
is important.
That's what I'm thinking about would be the kind of counter move, or the argument against what I was saying would be that isn't this a type of totalitarianism of psychoanalysis by other subjects? But I would say that the naivety of this type of counter move is incredible, since what they are obfuscating usually is the very process of analysis. I mean, it's not some type of like conquistadorianism of Freud trying to like overcome your own resistances and implant some type of ego there. That's the whole point of this workshop, to show that this is not Freud's approach. But in Freud, we can find even the material for arguments against this approach.
We can bring in here, I think, this notion of the jouissance of the other jouissance. When the subject is alienated within the big other, their jouissance is the jouissance of the other. And I think this is the crisis of meaning that you're talking about, where we no longer have this relationship with the big other, where we can enjoy the other's jouissance. So we know in this crisis of no longer having the jouissance of the other of language, the other of the symbolic, the signifier, and so on. So when you say we have a crisis of meaning, what I think what you're really saying is we have a jouissance crisis, because we no longer have the source of jouissance in the other.
I want to emphasize that I'm not saying there's a crisis of meaning. I'm saying there's a certain intellectual community which is identifying a meaning crisis, and I'm trying to situate my intuition, or my, I guess, a hypothesis I've been having is basically that the type of knowledge which is made explicit in Lacan and Zizek is what's missing in these intellectual communities, which I think you're articulating very well, is this knowledge of jouissance.
Yeah, perhaps maybe also, just maybe also the type of self-determination of the notion in a Hegelian sense, what is missing, or the reflexive move within language, which would be the recognition
well, that's
of
what
the
I mean,
lack
is that
of language.
If the jouissance is in the other, and then the other begins to fade away through separation, through this lack of the other, then we no longer have this jouissance, and so we have to find it somewhere. So we're searching for jouissance, and this is interpreted then as a search for a crisis of meaning. What does that mean? Oh, a crisis of meaning. It means there's a crisis in the big other. We no longer have the jouissance of the other. And so in that vacuum of jouissance, then we begin to have our own, our own phallic jouissance. And then it is then the course of analysis that not only shows us our own jouissance, but shows us maybe where there was a jouissance of the other that is no longer in play. So perhaps that is some coordinates there for understanding this notion of a crisis of meaning that you bring up.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, Eric, are you raising the problem of localizing jouissance? Is the problem of finding the topos, the place of jouissance in me, in the other, or whatever it can be? Because it's very risky we know that Lacan explored topologically this space and time of some jouissance, let's say. But that's very risky to talk about localizing jouissance. I thought it's outside space and time. This is jouissance in a way. So that's a very delicate question that Cadell raised, and I dare to bring the concept of Jacques-Alain Miller in this discussion of ordinary psychosis, and the idea that this lack of meaning, because when we talk about meaning, it's something related to the register, as you said, Eric, the register of the symbolic and the imaginary register. But what about the real? So
yeah, that notion of ordinary
lack
psychosis.
of meaning. Why do we need so much meaning? I think that we can be okay without meaning. We can be okay by being able to stay in a place, in a space without meaning, in between two meanings. And in this way, I want to finish my talk in the idea that I made a mistake. Please do not understand that I'm against science. No, I'm in between. different paradigms. I'm in between the scientific paradigm. I can use it as a very useful tool. I'm in between psychoanalytic, mystic, whatever paradigm. So I think that's important to be able to stay in a space without meaning and without thinking that this is awful and this is painful and this is provoking anxiety and psychotic reactions. Just accepting, as Socrates said, I don't know. I'm in between different ways of knowing, different paradigms. So I think in that way, we are creating some space for myself, for the other, for something totally new, without being afraid of what? What is at the end death or dream or being alive in this reality?
I think what you mentioned about ordinary psychosis, that was kind of in the background of my thought, is this general weakening or failure of the symbolic order in our day that is provoking this crisis of meaning, crisis of jouissance, whatever we want to call it. And so there is this, if there is an attempt to localize jouissance, it's perhaps trying to localize where the lack of jouissance is, because I think the finding jouissance is quite easy. It's easy to see whether someone's jouissance is the jouissance of the other, or whether it's phallic jouissance. I think that's fairly apparent. And so, but finding where it's lacking, that can, and then providing an appropriate jouissance, that is the real trick.
I think if I might say something about the ease of jouissance, it's like, to put it in sort of common political terms, let's say, I was talking earlier today about how, in a neoliberal political horizon, things get sort of reduced to oftentimes immediate gratification. And immediate gratification in some sense dictates the terms of the market in many ways. But the problem with that is that form of jouissance is actually extremely problematic when viewed from the point of view of development as a whole, or when viewed from the development of the subject as a totality, say like an old philosophical questions about what does it mean to live a good life. I think then it becomes extremely problematic, but I think, what's very precise, and what I love so much about your analysis is your situation of the emergence of something like the crisis of meaning in certain intellectual circles as correlated with the weakening of the symbolic order in our day. And if I would be so bold to situate this within the context of even the emergence of psychoanalysis at all, it would be that the strength of the symbolic order was embodied, within religious institutions, at least for holding the life history of the subject in many ways. And that sort of crumbling, like Nietzsche's Death of God and so forth, is now so complete in some sense, that we can no longer avoid problems that we might call metaphysical problems or religious problems. And in that regard, because I was when I was developing as an intellectual, I found the new atheists actually very attractive. This was quite a while ago now. But what I see in the new atheists is this sort of straw man critique of religion as a control and indoctrination technique. And what I want to make the distinction of is the difference between children being taught religious and metaphysical things as a form of indoctrination versus adults discussing deep metaphysical mysteries. I think that when adults discuss deep metaphysical mysteries, and when it comes to the intellectual communities that are talking about a meaning crisis and a sense-making crisis, most of them end up embodying intellectual communities that are discussing metaphysical mysteries. And I think that this openness and building a culture that is capable of discussing metaphysical mysteries is where we might find a jouissance that makes sense outside of a paradigm of neoliberal immediate gratification. I hope that made sense.
Cadell, the meaning crisis thing, in some ways I've been very obsessed with the idea of helplessness. And I look at this because, I mean, if you go outside the intellectual circles, what are the common languages that you see on Instagram, Twitter? You see self-help coaches, self-love lists, right? Take a spa, take a break, take some time.
You do you, girl.
Yeah, you know, a bunch of self-love, and I'm like, we don't even know what we don't even know what this is, but it is about enjoyment in some sense, some kind of. But then it's this, but this exact meaning crisis, in some sense, it's like this unconscious refusal for helplessness. But yet the paradox is that we cannot be less than helpless, and yet this helplessness is exactly the lack, but it is the lack that allows enjoyment. It is the only thing that makes possible enjoyment, right? Because when you're an infant, you are absolutely helpless, but it is the only, you could say, primal source. And this is why I'm starting to really like Adam Phillips, because he talks about this and Freud's helplessness. He says that helplessness is the primal motive for morality. Which is a very interesting lecture. But anyways, I found that he convinced me on this idea that helplessness is really the optimal state or possibility that one can have and hold. And so he advises this kind of, that we should be in this tense frustration, patient frustration for enjoyment, for satisfaction.
Man, that's what I've been doing. I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
Well, I just to play on that and to sort of make it sort of like bring it into line with, because probably most of the people here are operating under some Lacanian ideology, but the notion of the symbolic castration here is linked with this helplessness. And also linked to sort of what Eric's been saying about the weakening of the symbolic order, and also our, you know, the criticisms Lacan had against ego psychology as this demand that we build a strong ego. It's like, well, maybe not. Maybe the point of analysis isn't to build a strong ego. You know, maybe it's to bring us deeper to this, what you're identifying here, of the optimal state as a type of helplessness, you know, letting go. And I mean, I've never felt more, I've said this story a few times, but I've never felt more impotent than when I was getting my PhD, when I was finally getting my doctorate. I was like, you know, you imagine it as some powerful event, but I felt incredibly impotent, you know, and I think it's coming to terms with what does this mean here, this feeling of, and you know, and to counter that, you know, I've seen some professors who are in the older generation to me who would like have their email signature as like 5 different doctor titles. You know, I'm doctor. And I was just like, at some point, like, you know, when are you gonna admit that, you know, there's a problem here?
Cadell, excuse me. What is the difference between helplessness, vulnerability, and innocence? Vulnerability, innocence, and helplessness. Is there some?
Well, off the top of my head, let's take a stab at it. I mean, if you're helpless, you are in a vulnerable state, I would say. I guess that so I guess that a lot of people have trouble with vulnerability because they want to pretend that they're not helpless. So they have defenses against being vulnerable. But if you are helpless, ontologically, you are that, then by default, you're vulnerable. So I don't know if that, I'm trying to make a distinction there between helpless and vulnerability.
I don't agree with you so much, Kettle. In fact, when you were talking about your own self, when you use the word helpless, I thought that you should use the word vulnerable. One can choose to be vulnerable. One is vulnerable in love, but one is not vulnerable. One is not helpless in love. Vulnerability is a choice. Like a teacher can be vulnerable, a therapist can be vulnerable, an ethnographer can be vulnerable. Only then you can absorb. Only then you can be genuine to a situation if you are vulnerable. Not helpless, I would say. That's my take.
Okay. Try to make sense. So you said one is vulnerable in love, but not helpless.
Yeah. One can choose to be vulnerable in love. As a mother, one can be vulnerable to a child, but not helpless. When you allow yourself to be hurt, when you allow yourself to be injured, and it's not suffering also then.
And what's the relation to innocence and to authenticity?
In my head, Alexandra, innocence is the potentiality of innocence comes from that vulnerability. One can save the innocence only if one allows oneself to be vulnerable. Helplessness can be toxic at points. It can be, resentment, that what Nietzsche would talk. Helplessness might lead to that.
Yes, but I think Cadell was talking about the conscious helplessness. So about the helplessness,
I actually thought he should use the word vulnerable. I actually felt so, to the way, whatever he was talking about. Yeah.
Well, anyway, I haven't given much thought to these distinctions, but it's worth thinking about. Maybe we should leave that for the people viewing afterwards. Those are important distinctions to think about. Is there anything else from the text that anyone would want to bring up before we close here? Again, discussed the first paper as this recommendation to physicians. Jayati, I think you mentioned something in the chat there that might be worth discussing.
No, that's fine. I think I need to read up on that before asking, but we have short up time, but I wanted to ask you something from your lecture, Kedel.
Sure.
So, when you were talking about this desire for sublimation, and I understand what Freud was talking and how this desire for sublimation can lead some of the patients towards neurosis as well.
Yeah.
But you talked about your own case, and you said that you are this extreme case of sublimation, which then makes you go towards, which then becomes neurotic in your case. So I did not understand that.
Yeah, I definitely, for example, I encountered neurotic complexes during my doctorate, which were caused by my, I guess, ambition in some sense. Like if I had not engaged in a type of striving for my doctorate in the way that I did, the complexes that emerged during that process never would have been revealed to me, if that makes sense. If I had stayed in Freud's language, he says, there are some people who should, in some sense, stay closer to their instincts. So, for example, if it was up to my family, I would have stayed in my family home. I would have stayed in my family town. I would have lived a sort of modest life, gotten a job in the area, and never left. And if I had done that, I would never have encountered certain challenges that made me a little more neurotic than I otherwise became. But I think that in the challenges of sublimation, it's just to become aware that there are risks, there are psychological risks at stake, and that it's, in my experience, it's how you respond to those challenges as they emerge that will determine whether or not the neurosis does you in or enables you to reach a deeper layer of understanding or self-understanding, let's say.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. That makes.
It's interesting. I mean, I to be honest, the topic of sublimation is fascinating, and I feel like that we need more time to go into it than we have. But that you know, hopefully in a future workshop we'll be able to dive deeper into sublimation and its potentials. But it's definitely interesting in that paper that Freud, and he makes this clear in other papers as well, that not everyone has the same capacity for sublimation. And certainly I've met many people in my life who seem much more content in a sort of simple mode of life than I am, and that's fine. Like, I think it's about just simply allowing the natural interpretive capacities of the unconscious to unfold as they want to. And in my case, that led to certain desires for sublimation that maybe, you know, who knows what the distribution of this capacity is, but that's another conversation.
If I do remember, Anna Freud talked about sublimation as one of the mechanisms in which negative emotions as aggressiveness or whatever are transformed in some positive emotions. So some, in a way, some mechanisms, process of the ego to, or of the libido to transform from something unpleasant, from something dangerous or aggressive, or in something that gives you pleasure. But that's ego psychology, I think.
All right.
So in my opinion, in a not ego psychoanalysis, I would resonate sublimation with sublime. So with some ineffable gifted experience.
Well, and I think to that point, I think that there are a lot of people who can find that sublime dimension by staying very close to their instincts. And that's sort of the paradox of psychoanalysis, is that the instincts are not simply interpreted in a sort of biological reductionist way, but actually in a sort of metaphysical sublime way.
Yes, and there is a sublime of everyday life.
Exactly. So let's maybe end on that point. I just want to summarize for the people watching on YouTube that we covered two papers. The first paper as a sort of recommendation to physicians, where Freud introduces a second fundamental principle to psychoanalysis to couple with free association. He basically developed this idea of free interpretation, and then put that to work as a possible model for an analytic session, which I think has still a great utility for us thinking about you know, how to deal with symptoms and how to deal with transference. And then a second paper dealing with universal general categories of dreams, which we did touch on a little bit, and I think does have relevance to what came up in our conversation afterwards as it relates to the universal and the particular in science and psychoanalysis. And then I think we had again a very deep and rich conversation. So thank you all for your attendance. Thank you all for listening to the presentations, and I will send out a notification about the next workshop in a few weeks. All right, have a great day, guys.
Thanks, Cadell, and I look forward, hope you resume this soon, because I look forward to these meetings and also the selection of readings. You know, I wouldn't have read some of these readings had you not recommended them. So many thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Have a great day, guys.